On September 8, 1981, in Houston, Texas, 15-year-old Annette Criver and her mother, Mary Rose, were selling items that had belonged to Annette's late father and Mary's husband, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier in their backyard. Mary was unaware, but Annette was still deeply affected by the loss of her father. She spent a lot of time alone, writing poetry, drawing, playing the guitar, and singing. Her mother even asked her if she wanted to see a specialist to talk about it, but she replied that she was fine. During this time, Annette met 40-year-old Felix Vale. Perhaps it was because Annette missed her father so much, or because Felix possessed an incredible charm, but the girl became seriously infatuated with him. Her mother didn't see any threat in the man who appeared in their backyard on a motorcycle. After all, he was older than Annette. She noticed her daughter talking to him but assumed he was just another customer. Indeed, to be honest, Mary was too preoccupied with her own affairs to be vigilant. After her husband's death, she needed to find work, but she couldn't secure a job anywhere in Houston. Therefore, when an opportunity arose in the neighboring state of Oklahoma, she decided to move, leaving Annette in the care of a close friend so that her daughter could finish school in peace while she settled in her new place. It seemed like the ideal solution for everyone, but Mary soon deeply regretted it when she learned that the mysterious stranger was getting closer to her underage daughter. Annette didn't hide from her mother that her new friend occasionally dropped by, but her mother couldn't have imagined that her daughter's relationship with a man much older than her had gone so far. As it turned out, Felix would come very, very often. Annette seemed as if her mother had abandoned her, and Felix adeptly exploited her vulnerability. He easily managed to subjugate Annette to his influence and convinced her to go on a trip with him on his motorcycle after finishing school. At the same time, Mary, who was unaware of this, had been working hard for months to share excellent news with her daughter. She had bought a house for them, listing both of them as the owners. They could live together again. When the woman found out that her daughter had already left with Felix to aimlessly wander the country, she was distraught. Mary reproached herself for not being there with her daughter, for not making a different decision. Annette and Felix were living off the allowance Annette received after her father's death. She wrote letters to her mother, and a year later she called and asked for Mary's permission to marry Felix. The woman tried to persuade her daughter to wait until she turned 18, but she was adamant. Either they would marry with her permission in California, or they would go to Mexico and get married there. Understanding that she essentially had no choice, and fearing that refusal would push her daughter away, Mary agreed. Besides, Mary didn't know Felix, and she thought that if her daughter loved him, he must be a decent man. But soon after the wedding, Annette's letters increasingly hinted that Felix had changed. Imperceptibly, he had gained complete control over her life and even coerced his young wife into undergoing an illegal abortion when she became pregnant. Shocked, the mother urged her daughter to come home, and Annette found the courage to break free from Felix's grip and return to her mother. Despite Annette living back at home with her mother, it seemed as though only her shell had returned, while her soul remained somewhere else. She was not herself, lost. When the video was made, the mother and daughter were painting the walls in their new home, and Annette looked straight into the camera with that tense gaze as if saying, "What do you want from me?" Mary thought Annette was shaken by the extent to which Felix could influence her, but even if her daughter was no longer herself, the mother was happy that she was back home. Unfortunately, the respite was short-lived. Felix began cutting their phone lines, demanding to speak to his wife, and a few weeks later he simply showed up, walked in without permission, and headed straight for Annette. They spent some time together, after which they demanded that Mary leave the house. Mary did her best to resolve this issue with her daughter, but Felix's influence was too great, as the purchase of the house was funded not only by Mary's savings but also by the money of her late husband, Annette's father. And as the two women were listed as owners, Mary had no choice but to give in. She didn't want to leave her daughter for the second time, but she gave up her half of the house, packed her things, and moved to California. Soon Annette turned 18 and was able to access the money left to her as an inheritance from her father, around $100,000. Most of the sum went toward paying off Felix's debts. Annette also transferred the ownership of the house to him. Upon learning of this, Mary immediately called her son-in-law, but he told her that he had put her daughter on a bus and she was heading to Mexico. Supposedly, she set off on a journey for spiritual enlightenment and was planning to change her name so that she would never be found or bothered. His story made no sense, especially since the bus stop from which Annette supposedly left simply did not exist. Therefore, not believing a word from her son-in-law, Mary called the police to report her daughter's disappearance. Officers visited Felix, but unfortunately for Mary, he appeared as charming to them as her daughter had found him 3 years earlier. He easily convinced them that the girl had left on her own. Mary continued to try to contact the authorities, but since they refused to investigate the disappearance without any evidence, the woman was left with nothing but hope. Over the years, Mary sat by the phone waiting for a call on Christmas, on her and Annette's birthdays, on Mother's Day, expecting the girl to call and say, "Hi, Mom." But the years went by, and more doubts crept into her mind. She wondered why, if her daughter didn't want to see her, she wouldn't let other relatives know about her, especially since the mother had always supported her daughter, never pushed her away, and Annette couldn't hide her resentment over the years. After 7 years and hundreds of letters to the police, the FBI, and personally to Felix, all of which went unanswered, Mary decided she had had enough. She was not going to wait any longer for the police to take any action and began her own investigation. It is worth noting that the internet was only just emerging at that time, and any information had to be gathered piecemeal from various sources. She started with one solid lead she could find, Sue Jordan, Felix's sister, and traveled halfway across the country to meet her. After talking with her, Mary Rose received confirmation that her daughter could have been a victim of a crime, as Annette was not the only one of Felix's lovers who had come to harm. Sue told her that Felix had a wife, Mary Horton, who died under mysterious circumstances. Armed with this new information, Mary called someone she believed could help her piece together the full picture. Mary Horton's younger brother, Will Horton, had always suspected, along with his parents, that his sister's death was a murder, and his suspicions were further solidified when he answered Mary Rose's call in the early 2000s. Will didn't hold back any details about what he knew about the case. He was 15 years old when his older sister drowned in the Calcasieu River in Louisiana. Mary Horton met Felix in 1960 while attending college. They married 6 months later, and exactly 1 year after their wedding, their son Bill Vale was born. After Bill's birth, everything changed in the family, so much so that Mary fled to her parents with her son. She wanted to divorce her husband, but in those days the word divorce was almost taboo, especially for the Catholic family that the Hortons were. Therefore, her mother persuaded Mary to return home and try to reconcile with her husband, but she died before she could reach out to him. As Felix recounted, he and Mary asked their relatives to look after their 3-month-old son and took a friend's boat to go fishing, although Felix had never been known to engage in such a hobby before. The couple was 5 miles away from the shore, with Mary in the front of the boat holding a flashlight when she noticed a log sticking out of the water. Felix quickly turned the boat, and due to the sharp maneuver, Mary fell into the water. He jumped in to try to find her before returning to the shore and informing the police. From the outset, the police suspected him of lying because to return to the shore, he would have had to navigate 5 miles past other boats, docks, and encounter numerous people along the way. Why didn't he ask them for help? Additionally, Felix claimed that he and his wife intended to cast their fishing lines, but no fishing gear was found in the lake, which was generally considered unsuitable for fishing. It was also strange that Mary boarded the boat without a life jacket. The thing was, she had a severe fear of drowning. It was her phobia, so why didn't she wear the life jacket? According to Felix, she was breastfeeding the baby, and during this period, any additional clothing on her chest caused discomfort. Despite her fear of drowning, Mary knew how to swim and should have been able to make it to the shore. Felix insisted that she must have hit her head on a rock in the water, but there were no rocks in that part of the lake. Felix was arrested, but not found guilty because the case never made it to court. 2 days later, Mary's body was retrieved from the water. A scarf was wrapped around her mouth and neck. No water was found in her lungs. There was a large open wound on the back of her head, as if she had been struck by some object, and the sleeves of her sweater were covered in blood. Additionally, it was evident that she had been dragged. Everything indicated murder. However, to the coroner's astonishment, a different opinion formed. The coroner concluded that Mary drowned as a result of an accident. How could a murder case be investigated if the coroner said it wasn't murder? Felix had to be released. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout but didn't even pay for her funeral. In fact, he had taken out 2 insurance policies in Mary's name for $150,000 each, $500,000 in today's terms. One policy had been fully paid out several months before the accident. However, the insurance company suspected the husband and only paid him a portion of the money. Thus, the young widower Felix Vale retained his freedom, received the money, and once again roamed the cities in search of his next romantic adventure. And the next serious romance Felix got involved in was with Sharon Hensley, as Mary Rose told Will Horton. Sharon's mother contacted the Horton family, hoping they knew something about the whereabouts of Felix and her daughter, who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Once again, Mary Rose set out, this time to Bismarck, North Dakota, to meet Sharon's brother Brian Hensley. Sharon worked as a model, was professionally involved in dance, and was a very free-spirited young woman, like many young people in America in the late 60s. After his wife's death, Felix also fell under the spell of the hippie lifestyle. He became a wandering preacher, the leader of his own cult, the Holy Order of Mans. Around this time, he met 21-year-old Sharon, who set out on a trip to California. Despite the 10-year age difference, she was taken with him. Felix and Sharon didn't work but lived on the road, moving from vineyard to vineyard and mostly subsisting on grapes. He increasingly abused illicit substances and behaved more aggressively towards the girl. Her brother was certain that at that moment she stayed with him out of fear, not knowing how to extricate herself from this situation. During a visit to the girl's family, her relatives were horrified at the sight of her. The former model and dancer, she had always been beautiful, athletic, and fit. Now Sharon looked exhausted and lost. When she was asked a question, she only answered after Felix gave his permission. Soon Sharon called her mother for the last time, as it turned out. Felix must have been standing next to her, listening to every word, but even from her daughter's voice, her mother understood that the girl was in danger. However, the family was unable to do anything. By 1973, Sharon had stopped contacting her relatives and friends, and they did not know that she had disappeared for a whole year when Felix wrote to them, presenting a fantastic story that Sharon had left him to go to Australia on a boat with two strangers she had met in Florida. Felix told the Hensley family roughly the same thing that he would later tell Annette's mother, that she wanted to start a new life with a new identity and burned all documents before fleeing. Interestingly, initially the two Australians were called John and Vanessa, but later, Felix used different names. He supposedly didn't know their surnames at all. Of course, the Hensleys didn't buy it and reported their daughter missing, but with no evidence, the police had nothing to work with. Felix's tactic was clear. He took his daughters as far away from their mothers as possible before writing them letters stating that the girls no longer wanted to be contacted. What irony, Felix Vale always spoke of the girls' desire for freedom, but he completely controlled their lives and rarely let them go. Sharon Hensley never returned, and no one ever saw her again. From 1975 to 1977, several other very young girls became Felix's wives, but these marriages were very short-lived, which probably saved these girls' lives. Then in 1981, Felix Vale met 15-year-old Annette Crever. What happened to Mary and Felix's son, Bill, during all this time? At first, the young father left his son in the care of his parents, but when he went to California, he took the child with him. Mary Horton's family had no idea that Bill was forced to follow his father wherever he went. The boy suffered from his father's aggression until he was 8 years old when he ran to a police station in search of any help he could find. He told the officers that his father made him take illicit substances, supposedly to expand his consciousness, but he just wanted to go home. This led to the arrest of Felix and Sharon. After their arrest, Bill had to testify against his father. 3 months later, they were released, and they continued to travel together while the boy went to live with his maternal grandparents. Mary Rose believed that a visit to the now grown-up Bill could provide her with more evidence and clues about his father's whereabouts. She packed her things again and headed to Kansas to meet Bill and his family. Like previous visits, this one went quite well. Bill turned out to be an open, kind, and understanding person, but he was horrified at the thought of his father. He wanted Felix to stay as far away from his wife and children as possible, but he agreed to take the risk to seek justice for his mother. It was the man's story that confirmed all of Mary's fears. When the boy was 8 years old, before he ran to the police, he accidentally overheard a conversation between Felix and Sharon. Felix told the girl that he had killed Bill's mother. Sharon obviously didn't understand and began to calm him down, saying that it was natural for him to feel responsible for her death. But Felix replied, "No, you don't understand, I really killed her." After Felix's arrest, Bill was adopted by his maternal grandparents. but the fear of his father remained. He couldn't stop thinking that Felix would come back someday. He did indeed show up 5 years later, claiming that he just wanted to see his son. The boy was puzzled that Sharon wasn't with him, and his father told him that she would never bother anyone again. The boy understood what that meant, but couldn't share it with anyone. From that day on, Bill was certain that if he revealed this secret, he or his family could become the next victims. However, he responded to Mary Rose's request because he also wanted justice for his mother, Sharon, and Annette. Although Bill died of cancer in 2009, he asked the priest to record his words confessing Felix. After decades of searching, Mary Rose believed that now she had a case against Felix. There was still no physical evidence, but she believed that the testimonies of the Hortons, Hensley, her own, and Felix's son Bill could convince the FBI that the cases needed to be reopened. Unfortunately, it was precisely at this time that government budget cuts had a significant impact on the entire department of unsolved cases at the FBI, and once again, no one was willing to listen to Mary. She was ashamed that she had stirred up trouble, given hope to the families of the victims, and now it had all ended before it even began. In June 2011, almost 30 years after her daughter's disappearance, Mary Rose was listening to the radio at home when a program featuring an investigative reporter who had solved several high-profile cases began. In particular, he had uncovered a series of 8 murders that had remained unsolved for almost 50 years. Mary sat in her living room, stunned as she listened, and then realized that this man was not afraid of unsolved cases, and she needed to contact him. She didn't waste a minute, picked up the phone, and quickly managed to get in touch with the reporter from Mississippi, Jerry Mitchell. She asked him straight up, "Jerry, if you knew that a serial killer was on the loose, would you be interested in the case?" "Of course," he replied without hesitation, and Mary told him about Felix Vale. She tried to explain all the pieces of the puzzle that she had gathered, but one detail became known to her only recently. Felix had returned to Mississippi. It was a coincidence that could be taken as a sign from above. Mary had one more card up her sleeve. She had obtained Felix's exact address and was eager to pay him a surprise visit. Jerry's reaction to her idea was unexpected. He volunteered to go with her, so they set off to the provided address, a remote trailer park. As they circled Felix's residence, Mary noticed that the owner was not at home, but the back window of the trailer had been smashed. She crawled inside through it. Jerry couldn't shake off the thought that the homeowner might return any minute, but Mary remained undeterred. At 64 years old, she was tired of Felix Vale. She was determined to get to the truth, no matter the cost. Inside, with a camera in hand, she found a multitude of religious texts related to the cult and various weapons, but nothing that could be useful in their investigation. When Mary emerged from the trailer, she and Jerry noticed someone running toward them. It wasn't Felix, but one of his sisters, Kay Faulkner, who also lived in the trailer park. Initially, she didn't like their intrusion, but when they explained the reason for their visit, her expression changed. Kay stated that she, too, believed her brother had something to do with the girls' deaths. Felix had been uncontrollable since childhood, never acknowledging anyone's authority to the point that at 17, he was rejected when he tried to become a pilot. He had successfully passed all the tests and scored top marks, indicating impressive intellectual abilities, but his difficult nature and defiance would have been a problem during service. Even Felix's own family believed in his guilt because of his temperament. Pleasantly surprised that his first day of investigation had yielded so much fruit, Jerry Mitchell got to work. He listened to Bill Vale's testimony, spoke with the Hortons, Hensley, and Mary Rose, and he began to write. Of course, he had other projects as well, so the book was released 4 years later. However, it garnered numerous awards and created such a stir that the FBI employees reopened the cases. Felix was arrested 7 months after Jerry's work emerged. Mary Horton's case, the one that offered hope for a trial, had only her body found. But since her death had been deemed an accident, the police had never searched for or preserved any evidence related to her death. Nearly 50 years later, neither the police who worked on the case nor any evidence could be found. And yet they still needed to find the perpetrator, someone daring enough to take on a seemingly hopeless case. Hugh Holland turned out to be just the right person. Fortunately for him, private investigator Gina Frenzel learned about the case and decided to work on it pro bono. Gina enjoyed working undercover and managed to gain Felix's trust. When he was arrested, he gave her permission to visit his house. There, among the vast array of swords and cult literature, She found hidden stacks of personal journals that the man had been writing from the 1980s until 2010. His journals were incredibly detailed, filled with everyday things, such as what he had for breakfast in the morning. Felix admitted that he aimed to control every woman in his life and didn't shy away from physical violence. He even had a paragraph about how he enjoyed drinking fresh blood, but made no confessions of murder. Particularly, entire sections of the journals were missing precisely during the periods when something happened to Mary, Sharon, and Annette. Gina found only one indirect admission from the man. After his mother's death, Felix had to clean out the attic he occupied and burn part of the journals he kept there. During that time, he wrote that with all the family situations, and as he revisited and burned the journals, he learned to resolve conflicts without resorting to murder. Gina also found a birth certificate and a photo for Annette's passport in his house. This meant that the girl couldn't have gone to Mexico without documents since she didn't have a driver's license yet. But this was still not enough for the court, and the prosecutor began to search for witnesses. Incredibly, they found one. It was Ike Ebscher. Holland went to Ike's house to meet him. He was greeted by a 90-year-old man in a wheelchair, but fortunately, with a clear memory. Ike was a neighbor of Felix when he lived in Lake Charles. Ike's father owned a large boat, and the sheriff's office reached out to him to help search for Mary's body. Ike was on his father's boat when they found the body. He recounted that when Mary was pulled out of the water, everyone realized it was murder because her neck was swollen, and the scarf wasn't just wrapped around her neck and mouth, but was deeply inserted into her throat, clearly serving as a gag. But Ike didn't limit himself to memories of that day alone. He gave the prosecutor an envelope containing 2 photographs of Mary's body. The prosecutor didn't even expect to find anything like that since the police hadn't preserved any crime scene photos. With the evidence and the witness, the prosecutor charged Felix with the murder of his first wife. Ike was key to the case. Without his testimony, presenting those photos in court, it would have been impossible to prove it was a murder. 3 months after giving his testimony in court, Ike passed away, but the truth he managed to reveal was heard by the jury. Several more witnesses appeared in court. They were friends with Felix during the period when the man was married to Mary. He confessed to them that Mary was pregnant again. She thought that the birth of their second child would save their marriage. In reality, Felix didn't want even one child and hence killed her. In 2016, just 10 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Felix guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. During the sentencing, members of all 3 families sat together, holding hands. Over the years, thanks to Mary Rose's relentless pursuit of the truth, they had become one family. Of course, Felix was not convicted for what they believed he had done to the other girls, but 1, additional charges would not have affected the sentence. He would still have been sentenced to life imprisonment. 2, from their point of view, justice and truth still prevailed. The oldest unsolved case in the history of the United States ceased to be so and was solved after 54 years.
For 17 years, even the youngest residents of the French commune of Germain couldn't truly enjoy life due to the pervasive fear that gripped their families. Local resident Manon lives near the former home of the grieving family, and her parents told her about what happened when she was still a child. "We walk the same streets, so, of course, we are afraid that someone might attack or abduct us," the girl says. "My father always accompanied me, and now we finally know what he did, and he confessed to everything. That is somewhat comforting. For 17 whole years, it was impossible to see a child walking alone on the street." On January 9, 2003, 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin disappeared while returning home from school in her hometown of Germain, in the department of Seine-et-Marne near Paris. The girl lived with her mother Suzanne Mouzin, who was in the process of divorcing her husband and Estelle's father, Eric Mouzin. The father lived in the commune of Le Vessinet with her older brother Arthur, approximately 60 kilometers away from her mother's home. When Suzanne returned home from work at 7:30 p.m. and realized that her daughter was not there, she reported the child's disappearance to the police. In July 2003, the police began to suspect that serial killer Michel Fourniret might be involved in Estelle's disappearance because he had confessed to killing 7 people, including 3 young girls. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier appeared to be ordinary French retirees, he with his glasses and well-groomed hands in a professorial pose, and she, with her sunken cheeks, resembled a typical grandmother looking after her grandchildren. Behind this facade, however, lay one of France's most dangerous sexual predators, who committed his murders with the active involvement of his wife and faithful accomplice. This grey-haired couple stood alongside the most horrifying criminals in the country's history. Using her image as a happily married respectable wife, Olivier instilled confidence in the girls that they had nothing to fear, while the poor victims were about to become the next prey of the killers. Once the girls were kidnapped, bound and sometimes drugged, Olivier would inspect them, checking whether they were virgins, which her husband desired. The couple met after Fourniret was arrested in 1984 for sexual crimes in the Paris area, and placed an advertisement in a newspaper seeking a pen pal. Michel and Monique corresponded for a long time, and then, as it turned out, Fourniret proposed to Olivier, a former caregiver, to get rid of her two ex-husbands who, according to Monique, had mistreated her. In exchange, she promised to find young girls for him. Fourniret never fulfilled his promise, but 2 months after his release in 1987, Olivier did what she called her first offering to her beast. Isabelle Laville was a shy 17-year-old girl, who was seeing a therapist. Olivier said she chose her because she reminded her of her young self but was still an innocent girl that her husband desired. Olivier drove up to Isabelle in her car and asked for directions, convincing the girl to get in the car and show her the way. A little further down the road, Fourniret was waiting for them, pretending to be a motorist who needed help, because his car broke down. Olivier stopped and allowed the man to get in. As they continued on their way, Fourniret, sitting in the back seat, strangled the girl and announced that she was now their captive. On the way back to their home, they drugged Isabelle too much. At home, Fourniret found himself unable to assault the girl, so he had sex with Monique instead, and then he killed Isabelle by strangling her. In 2006, he led the police to her remains, which were dumped in an old well. Olivier claimed she didn't know that Fourniret would kill the girl. Whatever the case, the incident seemed to solidify the relationship between the couple. In 1988, while pregnant, Olivier asked 20-year-old student Fabienne Leroy for help, saying she urgently needed to see a doctor. The sympathetic girl got into the car, and this time, Fourniret was behind the wheel. He drove the car into a field and forced the victim to get out at gunpoint. After Olivier checked the girl's virginity, Fourniret assaulted and killed Fabienne. Her body was found in a field the next day, and the couple continued to find victims and kill them following their established pattern. When their son Salim was born, the criminals didn't hesitate to use him as bait, telling girls they needed a doctor for the baby. Even if Olivier didn't always accompany her husband on his trips, he would always tell her about his exploits, claiming that he went hunting or saying, "I found satisfaction." In 2003, Fourniret made a mistake. A 13-year-old girl he abducted in Belgium managed to escape from his van when he stopped at a gas station. She chewed through the rope he used to tie her wrists. The girl was picked up by a passing motorist, who noted down the van's license plate number. Fourniret was arrested, and in his car, they found several hairs, one of which belonged to Manania Thumpong, a 13-year-old girl whose remains were found in a forest in 2001. Fourniret was not eager to cooperate with the investigation, but the police from at least 5 countries, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, began reviewing cases of violence, abductions, and murders that remained unsolved, and resembled Fourniret's crimes. In Denmark, the police noticed that the composite sketch of a suspect in a violent crime closely resembled Fourniret, while in the Netherlands, Fourniret started to be suspected in the disappearance of 2 girls. In 2004, the criminal finally confessed to kidnapping and killing victims during the 1980s and 1990s, admitting to abducting 9 girls and young women during that time. He is also suspected of 10 more murders, 9 in France and 1 in Belgium. In 2006, Rumors circulated that Fourniret might be the true culprit in the case of Christian Ranucci. Christian, a 20-year-old man, was beheaded by the guillotine in France on July 28, 1976, after being suspected of killing 8-year-old Marie Dolores Rambler. This case had always been highly controversial. On June 3, 1974, Marie Dolores and her brother Jean met a young man driving a car, wearing a red sweater, who claimed he was looking for his lost dog. The man asked the children to help him, and Jean ran to search for the dog, while Marie Dolores got into the man's car and was abducted. An hour after the girl's disappearance, Christian's car, a grey Peugeot 304, was involved in an accident and left the scene. Witnesses described the driver's appearance to the police, who immediately concluded a connection between the abduction and the fleeing motorist. After a search, Marie Dolores' body was found in the bushes, where she had been strangled to death. Ranucci was arrested due to the car accident and the fact that he was allegedly carrying a heavy package. Police found trousers with dried blood stains in his car, and the blood group on the trousers matched the girl's blood group. At first, Ranucci confessed to the murder and told the police where he had hidden the knife, in the bushes. What was strange about this confession was that he only confessed to facts that the police had already established in the first 48 hours of the investigation. A day later, Ranucci denied his involvement in the crime. Allegedly, Ranucci's case was adjusted, and physical evidence was hidden to match his confession. The bloodstains on the trousers turned out to be much older and were merely the result of the man falling off a motorcycle. Moreover, Ranucci had the same blood group as the girl. An elderly couple who witnessed the incident claimed to have seen the girl on the backseat of Ranucci's car and heard her screaming. However, the credibility of this statement is questionable since the couple did not leave their own car, and the door of Ranucci's car was broken from the side opposite to where the pensioners claimed he had taken the girl out. Later, 5 more people claimed to have witnessed the abduction, and all of them described a man who looked nothing like Ranucci. 2 interesting points are worth noting. Firstly, Fourniret also drove a grey Peugeot 304, which from behind resembled a Simca 1100, a car described by 2 witnesses as the one the driver used to lure children inside on the day of Marie Dolores' abduction. The driver was wearing a red sweater, which was later found by investigators. As it turned out, the sweater found at the crime scene did not belong to Ranucci, as several sizes too small for an athletic-looking young man like him. Secondly, the most surprising discovery was a photograph taken by a photographer from a Marseille newspaper in March 1976 in the courtroom during Ranucci's trial. Among the visitors, there sat a man with glasses who suspiciously resembled Fourniret. Although the fact that Fourniret attended the trial was refuted, it is hard to deny that he is a much more suitable suspect in this case. For example, he went on vacation to Marseille in June 1974, driving a car of the same grey color and brand. At that time, he was 32 years old and, compared to Ranucci, already had a history of sexual crimes. Fourniret also frequently used the lost dog trick to lure young girls into his car. Additionally, no signs of violence were found on the child's body. Unfortunately for Ranucci, the media frenzy around the girl's murder made him a suspect even before the case went to trial. Immediately after his arrest, the press labeled him as the killer, and he was sentenced to death, becoming one of the last people executed in France. Why did the police begin to suspect that Michel Fourniret might be connected to the disappearance of Estelle Mouzin? 2 weeks before Estelle's disappearance, a 9-year-old girl was almost kidnapped by a man in a white van. The girl was able to describe the driver to the police, which led to the creation of a composite sketch of the suspect. When the police focused their efforts on Fourniret, who also drove a white van, they showed the girl a photo of him, hoping she would recognize him, but she didn't. Additionally, after his confession to the murders, Fourniret led the police to the burial site of one of his young victims. On the way there, he described the clothing the girl was wearing on the day of her abduction, which was similar to what Estelle was wearing on the day she disappeared, although the police believe this might be a mere coincidence. Sometime later, the police found photos of Estelle and recordings of television programs about the girl in Fourniret's house and on his computer. It's worth noting that 2 fragments of white shoelaces and black gloves were found with Fourniret, and Estelle was wearing white shoes and black gloves on the day of her disappearance. However, the police couldn't find any additional connections between the serial killer and the crime, and the hypothesis of Fourniret's involvement had to be discarded due to a lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. He claimed he made a phone call to his son from his home on the day the girl disappeared. Although there was no certainty that Fourniret actually made that call, the police believed he was not lying. Psychologists were also confident that Fourniret was not involved in the case because Estelle was too young for him. The 3 girls he confessed to murdering were 12 and 13 years old. His accomplice and wife, Monique Olivier, told the police that once when they were watching a TV program accusing Fourniret of killing Estelle, he laughed and said it wasn't him. In May 2010, the Mouzin family's lawyer requested a new investigation into Fourniret's involvement. In 2013, he was declared innocent after several hair analyses from his van, conducted when he was arrested in 2003, did not match Estelle's DNA. As for the second suspect in Estelle Mouzin's kidnapping, Nordal Lelandais, the police were interested in him in connection with 3 different crimes. He was the main suspect in the murder of Arthur Noyer, a soldier who disappeared in April, and whose skull was found in September. He was also the main suspect in the case of the disappearance of Maëlys de Araujo, a 9-year-old girl who was kidnapped from a wedding on August 27, 2017. 9-year-old Maëlys de Araujo was last seen on the night of August 27, 2017, at a wedding to which she was invited with her parents. At the event, the children were playing separately from the adult celebration. Around 3 a.m., her absence was noticed, and her search began initially without police involvement. A witness at the wedding recalled, the DJ of the evening announced over the microphone that a child was missing. Suddenly everyone started searching in the main hall and outside. It was terrible. To witness the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl, it's very serious. At first, we thought she fell asleep somewhere after playing hide and seek. An hour later, when she wasn't found, the police were called. The arriving police initiated the search for the child using search dogs and also explored the area with helicopters. All 180 guests invited to the wedding were interviewed. Almost immediately, investigators noticed inconsistencies in the statements of Nordal Lelandais, a friend of the groom. A week into the investigation, after crime scene analysts found DNA belonging to the girl on the dashboard of Lelandais' car, he was charged with her kidnapping. From that moment, Lelandais remained silent, refusing to assist the investigation, and claimed that even though the girl might have been in his car, it didn't prove his guilt. As the police conducted their investigation into the child's disappearance, they discovered other clues pointing to Lelandais' involvement. In particular, a surveillance camera captured a car belonging to the man leaving the wedding venue with a small figure on the passenger seat shortly before the girl's disappearance was reported. The blurry silhouette was wearing a white dress, similar to what Maëlys was wearing. The parents recognized elements of the dress, especially the child's ribbon, said their lawyer, Fabien Rajon. Additionally, Lelandais' phone was in airplane mode around the time of the girl's disappearance, and it turned back on 39 minutes later, when he returned to the celebration alone. It was also established that the next day, Lelandais spent several hours cleaning his car with powerful cleaning products. He claimed he did it to prepare the car for sale. Lelandais' defense initially disputed the timeline provided by the prosecution. His lawyer confirmed that while traces of the girl's DNA were found on his car's dashboard, his client completely denied kidnapping her. He stated that several DNA traces were found on the dashboard, and someone who had contact with the child could have transferred her DNA into the car. He also speculated that children could have gotten into the car without the driver's knowledge, noting that the windows were open during the celebration. After 6 months of investigation, Lelandais was forced to change his statements when Maëlys' blood was found in the trunk of his car. He confessed to killing the girl and apologized to her parents. Earlier, he had admitted that she was in his car on the night of her disappearance but claimed not to know anything about her subsequent fate. Now, he admitted that he unintentionally killed the child. The prosecutor from Grenoble, Jean-Yves Coquelet, stated that Leland Days led investigators to the location near his parents' home in Domessine, Savoie department, where the body was found. The search for the remains of the young girl took an entire day and was complicated by snow and rough terrain. Some of the girl's remains were found by the investigators and search dogs. The prosecutor from Grenoble said that Mayli's parents are no longer in the dark, adding that they know their daughter is dead, that she was killed, and that a few minutes ago, they were told that the child's remains were found. This is a horrific conclusion to the case, the culmination of 6 months of investigation and search, he added. The girl's mother addressed Leland Days through a Facebook message. We had to wait 5.5 months for this monster to finally speak. Maylies will haunt you day and night in your cell, she wrote, grieving. My little angel, I couldn't protect you from this predator, and I will blame myself for that for a long time. Nordal Leland Days, a former military dog handler who was also charged with the murder of a young soldier, claims that he killed Maylies do Araujo by mistake but refused to provide details of what happened. Post-mortem examination showed that the girl had a broken jaw, likely from a strong blow to the face. The prosecutors handling Maylies' case suspect Leland Days to be a serial killer. On December 21, 2017, he was charged with the murder of Arthur Noyer, a 23-year-old soldier who disappeared without a trace during a hike on April 12, 2017. The soldier's relatives admitted that they also hoped to learn the truth about his death. Arthur was last seen early in the morning on April 12, 2017, as he left a nightclub to go on a hike in Chambéry. Pieces of his skull were found on a hiking trail in the municipality of Montmelian, near Chambéry, in September. The phone company recorded Leland Days' phone in the same area at the time of the soldier's disappearance. Leland Days' Audi A3 was also spotted by surveillance cameras in the Chambéry area. During the investigation, police also searched his computer and phone, and it was revealed that 2 weeks after the soldier's disappearance, Leland Days entered the search query human body dismemberment. Over time, Leland Days confessed to investigators that he gave the soldier a ride but denied any involvement in his death before finally admitting to the murder on March 29, 2018. There are also suspicions that Leland Days may be responsible for the unsolved murder of 3 people in the Alps when a British man, his wife, and his mother-in-law were killed in a car park in a wooded area in September 2012. Other cases in which Leland Days may be involved include the disappearance of Adrien Murel, a 24-year-old Belgian man who went missing near Lake Annecy in July, and Jean-Christophe Morin and Ahmed Hamad, who disappeared in 2011 and 2012, respectively. Leland Days' alleged connections to these murders led the police to start reviewing other cases of missing people in the region as they feared he might be a serial killer. The police investigated his possible involvement in at least 10 other crimes. While investigating other potential crimes, Leland Days' connection to the case of Estelle Mouzin came to light. Maylies' disappearance bore similarities to Estelle's case, as the girls were about the same age, and both vanished without a trace, with no witnesses to the abductions. Recognizing this similarity, Estelle's family requested to determine Leland Days' whereabouts at the time of their daughter's disappearance. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it turned out that he was serving in the military in the Marne department, 150 kilometers away from where Estelle disappeared. Thus, law enforcement had to dismiss him as a second prospective suspect in Estelle Mouzin's abduction case. Over the course of several years while the search for Estelle was ongoing, other potential leads were discovered, which ultimately led nowhere. For instance, a real shock for the girl's family was the appearance of a photo allegedly of Estelle, which was taken from a website containing indecent images of children. Her father confessed how upset he was by the appearance of such a photo, but it turned out not to be his daughter. The girl in the photo appeared older than Estelle, and the image was taken several years before her disappearance. The police had no new leads, and the chances of finding Estelle were diminishing before their eyes. But then thunder struck on January 24, 2020, when Monique Olivier, the former wife of Michel Fourniret, claimed that her ex-husband killed Estelle Mouzin. On March 6, 2020, her statements were confirmed by Michel Fourniret himself. For years, Michel Fourniret denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance. However, 16.5 years later, on November 27, 2019, Michel Fourniret, a serial killer and predator of minors who was already serving a life sentence, became the primary suspect once again. He was charged with abduction and forced confinement, which ended in death. On January 24, 2020, Monique Olivier confirmed to Judge Sabine Keris that it was indeed her who made the phone call from their home to Fourniret's son on January 9, 2003, the day of the girl's disappearance. Not stopping there, she continued to narrate that the girl represented the type of victim her husband was seeking, and she was not too young for him as psychologists once claimed. She admitted that a few days before the abduction, her husband had been driving around the region and returned one evening, announcing that he had spotted a beautiful little target, as he put it. Responding to questions from the investigating judge after his alibi collapsed due to his former wife's confession, Fourniret finally confirmed that he abducted and killed the girl. However, the elderly Fourniret claimed during the hearing that he suffers from memory loss and was not formally charged. "It is very likely, even very, very likely, that I was the author of that disappearance," Fourniret said, asserting that nothing clicked in his head when he was shown a picture of the girl. "Since I cannot say for sure that I am responsible for her disappearance, I call on you to consider me as guilty," he added. Fourniret, 78 years old according to media reports, is suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, experiencing moments of absence, but is generally understood everything, according to Didier Sabin, the lawyer of Estelle's father. To corroborate Fourniret's statements, Monique Olivier was questioned again, and she confirmed that her husband did indeed abduct and kill Estelle Mouzin. Although Fourniret confessed to the girl's murder, he refused or was unable to reveal the location where he hid her body. He only mentioned that she might be on the property of one of his houses in the Ardennes. Forensics began the grim search for the girl's remains on Monday, June 22, 2020. Experts sealed off Fourniret's former home in northern France, more than 200 kilometers from where Estelle was abducted on her way home from school. The police also cordoned off another former residence of Fourniret in Château de Sautou, where the remains of other victims of the killer, a 12-year-old girl and a 22-year-old woman, were found in 2004. Unfortunately, they did not find Estelle's body. "We can report some progress, but some doors have been closed forever, places we can now discard," said one of the lawyers representing the Mouzin family. Even before Fourniret's confession to Estelle's murder, the serial killer, nicknamed the Monster of the Ardennes, as well as the Virginity Hunter, had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His accomplice, Monique Olivier, also received a life sentence with the possibility of parole only after 28 years.
On July 12, 1989, in the Goethe Forest east of Lüneburg, Germany, the bodies of a family of two who had gone on a picnic were discovered. Their killer had to be an exceptionally cold-blooded individual, because just as police were examining the crime scene, he was already out searching for his next victims. And he found them. Soon after, the wife of a wealthy businessman vanished without a trace in Lüneburg. But her disappearance attracted little attention due to the Goethe murders. A grave mistake, as would become clear nearly 3 decades later, because hidden in that very case was the key to uncovering the identity of Germany's most unusual serial killer. He committed murders that kept the entire northern part of the country on edge, and the fact that some of his crimes have now been solved, finally giving families the answers they long for, is thanks to one investigator who had lost his own sister. On the morning of August 15, 1989, the phone rang in Wolfgang Sielow's office. "Mom is missing," he heard through sobs. The voice belonged to Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister, 41-year-old Birgit Meyer. Wolfgang immediately knew that his sister wouldn't have simply vanished and abandoned her daughter. Even though Yasmin was no longer a child, she and her mother shared a very close and trusting bond. At the time, Wolfgang was the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, LKA, in Hamburg. However, even someone as influential as he was unable to persuade the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Birgit lived, to conduct a thorough investigation into her disappearance. There were two reasons for this. First, the Lüneburg police were already fully occupied with investigating two double murders, which had become their top priority. Second, and perhaps more critically, they had a suspect from the very beginning. Birgit's husband, Harold Meyer, a successful businessman in the printing industry. Harold had separated from Birgit just months before her disappearance and had already begun seeing another woman. Birgit, who was not working at the time, struggled more with the impending divorce and at times sought comfort in alcohol. Yet on the evening of August 14, 1989, Birgit greeted her husband with a smile. Harold had come over to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that Birgit had finally come to terms with her emotions. The conversation was reportedly amicable. They agreed that Birgit would receive 500,000 Deutschmarks and move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The next day, they were to meet at the notary's office. However, on the morning of July 12th, Jasmine discovered her mother was missing. Her Opel Cabriolet was parked in the garage, but the woman herself was nowhere to be found in the house. As would later become known, her documents had also disappeared. Apart from a shoe print near Birgit's house, there were no signs of a crime, no blood, no struggle. According to Birgit's husband, the previous evening had passed normally and they had not argued. After the husband left, the woman spoke on the phone with her mother and daughter and also said that she and her husband had not fought and that the meeting went well. However, despite Harold's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to get rid of his wife and avoid paying her 500,000. Today, Harold Meyer still lives in the very house from which his wife vanished without a trace. He recalls that Birgit had always remained his friend, someone he could completely rely on. However, many believed Harold was guilty, first of her disappearance and then of her murder. He constantly heard whispers. His friends quietly wondered whether he had taken Birgit away in his Porsche and disposed of her body at sea from a motorboat. Even in his own daughter's gaze, there were moments where a silent question seemed to flash. Could he know something about what happened to her mother? Could the police be right in their suspicions? Only Wolfgang Siloff believed that Harold had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance, because Birgit and Harold had never argued over money. When Birgit met Harold that evening, 32 years ago, she was dressed beautifully, and he noticed she had had a drink or two to lift her mood. He teased her, suggesting she probably wasn't planning to spend the evening alone. She playfully replied, "Who knows?" Now he believes that in that moment, her killer may have already been nearby, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. However, it was only 6 weeks after Birgit disappeared that Harold first became suspicious about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day she vanished, Birgit had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener. Allegedly, he had rung Birgit's doorbell, introduced himself, and asked how to get to the neighboring house, even though he already knew the address. Harold didn't know what to make of it. He remembered a party at the neighbor's, where the gardener had also been present. A quiet, silent man, blond with very handsome features, but a chilling stare. Harold recalled being deeply unsettled by the cold, assessing look in his icy eyes. He later found out that Birgit had met him a few months before her disappearance at that very same party. She had drunk a bit too much, and the gardener had walked her home. Harold reported this man to the police. Investigators found out that the gardener, who also worked part-time at a cemetery, was named Kurt Werner Wickman, a handsome but extremely dangerous man. Even as a child, he had threatened a young mother and her baby with a knife. In early adulthood, he abducted a hitchhiking girl, sexually assaulted her, and nearly killed her. After that attack, he spent 5.5 years in prison. Investigators decided to speak with Wickman in person and invited him to the station. He arrived wearing gloves, explaining that he had an allergy. The man claimed he had an alibi for the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he had spent the entire evening at home and only went out briefly to walk his German Shepherd around 10 p.m., which he said lasted no more than 15 minutes. His wife confirmed his story. Wickman wisely chose not to mention that, on the day Birgit disappeared, he was actually on sick leave and didn't need to go to work at all. It would have been incredibly easy for police to verify this, but surprisingly, not a single investigator considered Wickman a serious suspect. Wolfgang later noted that, at the very least, a preliminary investigation should have been launched. but it never happened. Anytime he tried to ask for more details, the conversations would abruptly end. Days turned into months and months into years, until a new prosecutor in Lüneburg took over the case. It wasn't until 1993, 3.5 years after Birgit's disappearance, that a formal criminal case was opened against Kurt Werner Wichmann on suspicion of murdering Birgit Meyer. On a cold February morning in 1993, police knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, the home of Kurt Werner Wichmann. His wife answered. Her husband wasn't home. The officers presented a search warrant and got to work. A sniffer dog immediately led them to a recently demolished drywall partition in the basement. On the ground floor, they noticed a soundproof door. Wichmann's wife explained that she didn't have a key, only her husband and his brother did. The officers forced the door open, revealing a true arsenal: 2 small-caliber rifles, a revolver, silencers, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sleeping pills, chains, cords, and blood-stained handcuffs. The police confiscated it all. While searching the property surrounding the house, a metal detector went off. With the help of an excavator, police unearthed something extraordinary in Wichmann's garden: an entire vehicle, a brand new, bright red Ford sports coupe. On the back seat, forensic experts found traces of blood. The sniffer dog also clearly reacted to the scent of a body in the car, but there was no body to be found. A bit later, police discovered a Volkswagen Golf parked near Lüneburg, registered to Wichmann. Inside were road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars, gear more suited to a hunter or someone who spends long periods tracking people they plan to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade law enforcement. However, on April 15, 1993, an accident occurred on a rural road near Heilbronn. Police inspected the vehicle, which held 2 men. Weapons were found inside, so the driver was taken to the station. There, it was discovered that the driver was Kurt, and the man next to him was his younger brother. At the police station, officers didn't consider Kurt a danger to himself, so they did not confiscate his belt. On April 25, 1993, Kurt was found dead in his prison cell. He was 43 years old. The police quickly closed the case, as under German criminal procedure law, deceased individuals cannot be the subject of an investigation. But this was far from the end. In fact, it marked the beginning of an inquiry that would eventually uncover some of the most horrifying crimes in the country's history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was finally able to devote more time and attention to his sister's case. He gained access to the case files and was horrified. To his shock, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that had been unearthed. Even the basement in Kurt's house, where the sniffer dog had detected the scent of human remains, had never been thoroughly investigated. In Wolfgang's view, the evidence should have been preserved. First, because there is no statute of limitations for murder in Germany, and second, because the principle of not investigating deceased suspects didn't apply here. There was still another person under suspicion: Birgit's husband, Harold. To either exonerate or implicate him, police needed to examine all the evidence, question Wichmann's neighbors, and conduct a proper investigation. But now much of that was no longer possible. Still, Wolfgang refused to give up. He assembled a small team of former colleagues who volunteered their time. Over and over, they analyzed motives, the possible sequence of events, and the behavior of the perpetrator. Finally, a new theory emerged. Birgit's disappearance might be linked to other unsolved crimes. Searching for proof, Wolfgang returned to Wichmann's house. The hidden room had changed little since it was first discovered in 1993. There, he found recordings of 2 TV programs, one about Birgit Meyer's disappearance, the other about the Goethe murders. Wolfgang immediately alerted the Lüneburg police, but nothing happened. For years, the cases remained officially unsolved. In 2015, a new chief was appointed at the Lüneburg Criminal Police Office. Wolfgang succeeded in convincing him to form a special commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by Richard Kaufmann, an experienced, and in the best sense of the word, meticulous investigator who had solved every case he'd handled in recent years. Kaufmann discovered that on the handcuffs found in Wichmann's hidden room, there was a tiny drop of blood. The sample hadn't been destroyed because it had been stored at the Medical University of Hanover. A DNA comparison confirmed that the blood belonged to Birgit Meyer. There was now no doubt that Wichmann had shackled Birgit with the handcuffs and most likely killed her. The investigator hypothesized that Wichmann may have intended to kidnap Birgit and demand a ransom from her husband, Harold. But something went wrong, and clearly there must have been at least 2 people involved in the abduction, since a neighbor reported hearing the sound of a car engine running that night. Where could Birgit's body have been? The investigator examined several graves that had been dug in the cemetery where Wichmann had once worked, but Birgit Meyer wasn't among them. That's when Wolfgang decided to dig deeper into the man's past. First of all, Wichmann was not a troubled boy from a loving family. His father often threatened his mother with an axe and was violent toward his sons. Young Kurt Werner Wichmann ended up in the Wickenstift Social Institution and, after returning from New Year's holidays in 1964, didn't want to go back. But he needed money to escape. So at the age of 14, he broke into the apartment of one of his parents' tenants, a young mother with a baby, armed with a dagger and a flashlight. The woman woke up to the light, screamed, and Wichmann briefly strangled her to silence her. Then he turned toward the child. For a moment, the mother feared he would hurt her baby, but fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the girl whom 22-year-old Kurt offered a ride in 1970 wasn't so lucky. He picked her up while she was hitchhiking, drove into the woods and attacked her. After getting what he wanted, he partially strangled her and threw her into the trunk, presumably to bury her later. But something incredible happened. When he opened the trunk again, the girl had regained consciousness and managed to talk him into letting her go, claiming he had nothing to fear from her. 2 days later, when Wichmann read a newspaper article about the attack, he realized it didn't match how he remembered it. So what did he do? He went to the police, supposedly to clarify some details. As a result, those clarifications earned him 5.5 years in prison. Understanding the kind of person Kurt was, Wolfgang came to a conclusion. Wichmann was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist who cared deeply about how he was perceived. That need to control was so strong, he even turned himself in after a crime, just to manage the narrative. So of course he had to control where his victim's body was hidden. Wolfgang suspected Birgit's remains might be hidden on Wichmann's own property, perhaps even inside the house. It was a painful thought, especially since he had begged the Lüneburg police years earlier to conduct a thorough search of that house. But they dismissed his concerns. The head of the investigation team told him his criminal experience told him Birgit wasn't there. When he said that, he was standing just above her body, separated from it by nothing but a concrete slab. Years later, Wolfgang finally had the garage floor dug up. Beneath the concrete, he found what remained of his sister. The autopsy revealed that Birgit Meyer had been killed with a gunshot to the head. The Birgit Meyer case had been solved, but Wolfgang decided not to stop there, remembering the other families still waiting for answers about the crimes that had affected their loved ones. And so, thanks solely to Wolfgang's persistence, by the end of 2017, a case that had once terrified all of northern Germany in the 1990s was reopened and finally solved: the Goethe murders. In July 1989, northern Germany was experiencing hot, sunny weather, and many people sought relief in the cool shade of the forest. On July 12, 1989, just 2 days before Birgit's disappearance, 3 people picking blueberries in Goethe were suddenly overwhelmed by a nauseatingly sweet smell. Trying to find the source, they spotted a human hand under a pine tree. As it turned out, back on May 21, 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reynold, had gone on a picnic in the forest, hoping to enjoy a relaxing day outdoors. Both were brutally murdered, and their bodies were dragged far from the site of the attack. When found, the couple was nearly naked. It remained unclear whether the killer had undressed them or if they had done so themselves before the attack. The killer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and car keys, and then drove off in their car. The vehicle was later found in another city. Though the couple had been reported missing, their bodies were not found for 7 weeks. Due to the summer heat, little remained of their corpses, and the cause of death could not be determined. However, robbery was ruled out, as valuables were still found on the bodies. Since mobile phones didn't exist yet, the berry pickers rushed to find a forest ranger to contact the police. But what truly terrified the public and earned Goethe the chilling nickname, the Forest of Death, it was the shocking fact that, while police were still investigating the remains of Peter and Ursula, the killer struck again, murdering another couple just 800 meters from the ongoing crime scene. On July 12, 1989, 46-year-old Ingrid Wormbier and 43-year-old Bernd Michael Kopping from Hanover had also arrived in Goethe. The two were married, but not to each other, which is why they had chosen the seclusion of the forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers deeper into the woods. Both were brutally murdered. Once again, the killer took their Polaroid camera and car keys and drove away. It was later confirmed that he used their car for about a week before abandoning it. Their bodies were found by chance 2 weeks later, during a police search in connection with the first murder. The 2 crime scenes were only 800 meters apart. However, later testing revealed that, due to the location of the murders in low-lying forested areas, the officers working the first scene would not have heard the gunshots. With this new discovery, a seemingly minor encounter suddenly took on greater importance. As the blueberry pickers rushed to alert the ranger, they crossed paths with a man. Of course, after 2 weeks, their description was vague, but they remembered a tall, fit man in his 40s, a brunette with medium-length hair, no glasses, no beard. He was carrying a bag, clearly not empty. Based on their account, a composite sketch was created, even if it turned out the man had nothing to do with the crime. What these murders had in common was that they were committed in the same area of a vast forest. Additionally, the victims were both middle-aged. In 2 cases, the killer stole the victims' belongings, although it wasn't a typical robbery. He left the crime scenes using the victims' cars, then abandoned the vehicles in small towns with railway connections. Both towns lie on the Hanover-Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to suspect that the same person was responsible. In 1989, Wickman was 40 years old and lived about 30 kilometers from Goethe. On the day the secret lovers were murdered, he was on sick leave. The married couple was killed on a Sunday, also a day when Kurt did not have to work. However, the investigators originally assigned to the Goethe murders found no evidence linking Wickman to the Goethe crime scenes. Moreover, he did not resemble the composite sketch. Therefore, the police focused on other suspects. In particular, they suspected that the deceived husband of the second crime's victim had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover. But this man accidentally killed the wrong 2 people before completing the job. Once again, Wolfgang could not understand the investigators' decision. He and his team of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt fit the profile of the Goethe killer. The brutality of the crimes, the intimate nature revealed by the women's disheveled clothing, all matched Wickman's profile. Moreover, many years ago, Wolfgang had found a video recording in Kurt's secret room, an episode of the TV show Aktenzeichen XY that covered the Goethe murders. Kurt, being a narcissist, also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Birgit Meyer. There was also evidence that the man had searched for information about relatives of Bernd Michael Kopping, who was killed in Goethe. But the final breakthrough in the case, as often happens today, came from DNA analysis. The Goethe killer had a habit of driving his victims' cars for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological material were found. However, it took almost 30 years before the DNA in the car was compared with Kurt's. Only at the end of 2017 did the analysis return a result, a match. The perpetrator of the 2 Goethe murders was Kurt Werner Wickman. After this discovery, a special investigative team was formed in Lüneburg to analyze the murders committed by Wickman and to create a criminal profile. It was assumed he might be connected to up to 24 other murders. The police also planned to analyze similar crimes in other European countries, suspecting Wickman could be involved. However, in early 2020, the police announced that they had examined half of the collected evidence, and aside from 5 murders conclusively linked to Wickman, they could not establish connections to other cases. The question of motives and at least one other person involved in all of his cases remains open. If he left Goethe in the victims' cars, how did he get to Goethe in the first place? And what was the noise of a running engine that Birgit's neighbor heard? There is a man who knew Kurt better than anyone else, but will he talk to the police? This is Kurt's brother, 10 years younger. He was very dependent on his brother and asked him for advice on everything, even the smallest matters. In his farewell letters, Kurt gave him instructions that can be interpreted as coded messages. For example, he told him to clean the drain above the basement entrance once, but very carefully. A rather strange final request, isn't it? Surely he knows more than he will ever reveal about his brother in his life. A small, quiet, silent man, the complete opposite of his brother, or maybe not.
Musketeer, Indian, Marquise, and Piero, dressed up in masquerade costumes, 4 girls set off for the carnival. For Peggy and Amelie, It's unthinkable to miss the famous Shrove Tuesday masquerade, especially since they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey this year. The girls spent the entire second half of the day getting ready. Finally, the preparations are complete, and their mother takes a picture of her smiling daughters in anticipation. Could she imagine that the festive evening could turn into a drama? Could anyone imagine that the girls would fall into the hands of strangers, whose cruelty France would soon dub them as the Siamese brothers of horror? On Tuesday, February 11, 1997, Le Portel, a small town on the southern coast of Boulogne-sur-Mer, was celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festival was in full swing, and tonight was the last night that everyone was eagerly anticipating. The Merlin sisters, Peggy and Amélie, had never missed it. Today they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey Raffin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amélie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Raffin sisters moved to Le Portel. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabel. The girls spent the entire half of the day getting ready. Everything had to be perfect for the carnival evening. Finally, they were ready. Peggy transformed into a marquise, Amélie into Pierrot, Audrey chose a musketeer costume, and Isabel turned into an Indian. Their older sister Virginia joined Audrey and Isabel. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls left the house to walk to the square where the festival was taking place. Despite the cold and rain that evening, all 5 were in a great mood. The friends sang and danced together with everyone. People in carnival costumes gathered from all sides. Meeting their friends, they briefly stopped at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it was time to go down to the Partel beach to see the highlight of the show, the burning of Batista, a rag doll. This was the highlight that Peggy and Amélie wanted to show Audrey and Isabel. A huge bonfire had already been prepared on the beach. At midnight, the rag doll burned out, and as tradition requires, all carnival participants head to the village of Equien, located 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours before that, the girls agreed to meet their friend Eve halfway and go together. But the young man never saw the girls. He decided that they had changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amélie's. In reality, there was no reason for Eve to worry since many people gathered at the carnival, and the townspeople in carnival costumes continued to walk back and forth between Partel and Equien. Morning came. The carnival was over and Peggy's and Amélie's mother came to the main square to pick them up. Marie-José Merlin bought croissants to have a snack with her daughters and listen to their stories about the evening, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. The woman returned home around 7:30 a.m., woke up Virginia and asked where the girls were and why they hadn't returned yet. Virginia replied that the carnival ends at 6 to 7 a.m. and they need more time to get back, or they might have stayed overnight at Isabel and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabel and Audrey's mother was also starting to get nervous. She had let her daughters go to the carnival and worried that they hadn't returned yet, but thought they had stayed overnight at Marie-José's. As time went on, and when the 2 mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were. Anxiety was growing. It was not like the girls to disappear like this. They always let their families know if they were going to be late. At 9 o'clock in the evening, driven mad with worry, the parents went to the police station. But to their deep disappointment, the police officers were not at all concerned. The girls were at an age when they could relax and forget about everything, especially during the carnival season. The police officers assumed that there was a carnival in the neighboring town and the girls went there to have fun. In other words, the girls' disappearance amounted to a simple escape. However, the parents knew for sure that they would not have run away in carnival costumes without money and documents. Moreover, they were very attached to their mothers. Marie-José Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack and the daughters were afraid to do anything that could upset their mother. Isabel and Audrey were also attached to their foster mother, Loa. The woman had adopted Audrey, Isabel, and their older sister Virginia after their mother's death when the girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. The girls appreciated the love that surrounded them and would not have run away. Convinced that there was no point in running away and faced with the lack of reaction from the police, the relatives organized the search themselves. They began to post flyers around the city, searched the lighthouse, beaches, and abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even inspected the abandoned tunnel of the city. The family even approached the boats moored at the pier and knocked on them, assuming that the girls could be locked inside. In a cafe, they found a souvenir photo of Audrey in a musketeer costume, which confirmed that they were at the carnival. But for the next 48 hours, there was no other news about the girls. Then, thanks to flyers, calls from witnesses began to come to the Lamotte family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Portel and remembered 4 outfits. But after the crowd headed to Equain, no one saw them. What is even more disturbing, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes, the passengers of which were staring at the walkers, following them, and generally behaving suspiciously. They also attracted increased attention because on that carnival evening, they were without costumes. This was a very interesting lead, but the police continued to adhere to the version of the escape. Families who were tired of hearing the same excuses decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the escape version, and on Sunday, February 16, an article appeared in the local newspaper. The journalist mentioned the van with green stripes. Reporters from all over the country picked up the story. Faced with pressure from the media, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that the escape may not be the only version of what happened. After 6 days of the girls' disappearance, the investigation started from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van was spotted on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, a family of 2, who reported the car's license plate number. At the same time, another call came into Laura's house. The woman reported that the wanted van was located in a neighboring village. According to the woman, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers who were well known in the village for their crimes. The woman added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. With the license plate number, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Jordan. Could the brothers be the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out that the brothers were long known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated in completely unsuitable conditions for normal life. These people lived separately from society. According to rumors, their mother practiced incestuous relations with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis is the eldest in the family. He suffers from developmental abnormalities, was convicted of harassing girls, and spent 1.5 years behind bars. Barely released from prison, he received 10 years for violence against a girl but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal career is even more impressive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so fiercely that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is rare. After his release from prison, when his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassonville. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, young Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a great husband and caring father, an opinion that was not shared by many. Those around him considered him a bundle of nerves with muscles. If young girls fell into the hands of the brothers, one should beware of the worst. The police had enough of this to interrogate the brothers. On Wednesday, a week after the girls' disappearance, the police carried out a large-scale operation to detain the Jordan brothers. And if they are the ones holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. Upon arrest, the brothers did not resist, but were surprised by the police's appearance. There were no girls in the house, although what the police saw there horrified them. The house resembled more of a dump, and there was a strong smell of filth. A little boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd and was eating from a dog bowl. In total, there were 9 people living in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized a van. It had been repainted, but what was even worse, the interior had been thoroughly clean. What are the brothers trying to hide? A race against time began for the investigators. They can only detain the brothers for up to 48 hours and need to make them talk, because right now, they have suspicions, but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not approached the carnival square. However, after the testimony of numerous witnesses was presented to them, they admitted to simply passing by but swore they had not crossed paths with any of the girls. By Friday morning, after the brothers had been in custody for 30 hours, time was running out for the investigators. So they decided to change tactics. The detective knew that the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was likely already dead. Jean-Louis was deeply attached to his sister and had been grieving her loss for a long time. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began telling the suspect about each one. He appealed to Jean-Louis' emotions, saying that they had families waiting for them. Although they couldn't save his sister, there was still a chance to help the girls and return them to their families. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and declared that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. Journalists gathered outside the police station watched as the police car raced off in an unknown direction, and they followed. The entire procession stopped at the base of a dune. The police, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he had indicated. They had to dig for a very long time, so long that the detectives thought the man had deceived them and that there were no bodies there. Suddenly, a piece of red fabric from one of the musketeer costumes emerged. All 4 girls were lying in a pit measuring 1 by 2 meters. They were wearing carnival costumes that they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, impatient journalists saw 4 hearses approaching. They arrived in silence. Then it became clear to them that the hearses were carrying the bodies of the 4 missing friends, and they rushed to report the news to the public. The families of the girls learned of the horrific news from the radio. The missing girls were found, but the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24th, forensic experts conducted an autopsy. They discovered that the perpetrators had chosen strangulation as their method of murder, and had sexually assaulted 3 of the victims. Isabel became the first victim. She was severely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the most resistance to her kidnappers. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then attempted to be strangled. However, she was buried alive. Sand was found in her esophagus, indicating that she was still breathing when she was buried. Amelie was even more beaten than the previous 2 girls. She was sexually assaulted and then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one alive, the perpetrators likely just played with her. Now the police wanted to know how it all happened. But during questioning, the brothers presented conflicting versions that only began the same way. Around 11 p.m., they met 4 girls dressed as musketeers, an Indian, a Marquise, and Pierrot, and agreed to give them a ride to Ikayan. They only had to drive 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly noticed that they had been driving too long and in the wrong direction. They yelled that they wanted to get out. One of the girls tried to open the van door, but it was blocked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel ordered him to calm down the captives, while he himself drove the van even faster. They arrived at Saint-Cécile Beach and brought the captives to an abandoned bunker. These are defensive structures that have survived in France since the war. The bunker has only one exit, which makes it an ideal prison for captives. And this is where the brothers' versions diverge. Jean-Louis said that he was guarding the girls in the blockhouse while Jean and Michel took them one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them to the top of the dune, where 3 girls were lying motionless on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the fourth victim, and they buried the bodies together. Jean-Michel, in turn, admits that he led the victims to the blockhouse, but once inside, he left them in the company of his brother and went back for the keys, which he had left in the van. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the top of the dune. They buried 2 of them. So, each of the brothers denies violence and murder. The most they did was to help bury the bodies. Without being able to rely on the suspects' statements, the detectives waited for evidence to prove the brothers' involvement in the murder. Forensic experts started with examining the van, which was an ideal trap. The lock on the back door was broken so that it could only be opened from the outside, and the van was cleaned out. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found a piece of a earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that was torn off of her. This was evidence that the girls were brutally beaten inside the van. The problem was that besides the valuable evidence, the police did not find any DNA evidence of the brothers or the girls. They found some suspicious stains, possibly blood, but they were unable to conduct an analysis. Of course, the brothers cleaned it perfectly, but in 1999, the police did not have modern DNA analysis tools. Therefore, there was very little physical evidence to link the Jordan brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow for the exact identification of the perpetrator. Learning about this, Jean-Michel used this opportunity to retract his previous statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With minimal evidence and conflicting testimonies, the investigation could only rely on the reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so the words of Jean-Louis were the only ones that could be verified. He showed the path that he, his brother, and the victims took towards the blackthorn bush. More accurately, they didn't walk, but rather crept because they first had to descend to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it rained on the night of the tragedy, and the tide reached almost to the blackthorn bush. Could 2 brothers lead 4 girls against their will over wet and slippery stones in pitch darkness? But Jean-Louis insists that his brother then escorted each girl to the top of the dune. He describes the order in which his brother led the girls, of course not by name, but by their masquerade costumes. However, in the blackthorn bush, it was pitch dark, and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have seen their costumes? Furthermore, the path he indicates is strewn with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire on it, on which no piece of fabric was found, although the girls could not have crossed it without tearing their elaborate masquerade costumes. A careful examination of the girls' costumes did not reveal any tears or even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones being, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between themselves? The psychiatrist who talked to them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have remained hungry? Yet each of them insisted that at most, they helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation is over, the jury will have to decide this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in St. Amma. During the trial, it became known that a few days before the carnival, the predators were already searching for prey. They almost kidnapped a young woman in Bursa. She had been in a phone booth for 19 hours, and her friend was calling from another nearby booth. The girl noticed a van with green stripes that pulled up next to the payphone. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her intently when Jean-Louis appeared, ready to pull her inside by force. Luckily, her friend approached at that moment. Jean-Louis saw him, closed the door, and the van drove away. This was not the only similar story that the jurors heard, leading them to believe that the brothers had bought the van specifically for the purpose of kidnapping girls. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim that he had done nothing. It was like talking to a wall when trying to talk to his brother. The prosecutor was worried that the jurors would only accuse Jean-Michel, believing he had played a passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning game. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that all participants in the trial be taken to the scene of the incident. Such a practice is very rare, but in this case, the prosecution considered it necessary to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all court participants went to the beach of St. Cecile. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the Blackthorn. And you still need to climb to the top of the dune, overcoming a series of barbed wire. It is impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes and trying to escape. Obviously, the girls were never in Blackthorn. This explains why, despite multiple signs of violence, there was no sand in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the results of the autopsy, the rape could not have occurred on the beach. The prosecutor is sure the violence and murder took place in the van in the presence of two brothers. They put the girls in the van, promising to take them to the beach. When Isabel realized that they were not going there, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her fiercely to calm her down. In turn, Jean-Michel parked the van in a secluded corner of the campsite in the dunes, which is deserted at this time of year. The man turned off the engine and joined the girls and brother in the back of the van. The van was the instrument of the murder of the poor girls. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that they were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA found under Amelie's fingernails provides additional heartbreaking details of the violence. While the girls were being abused, they held on to each other, seeking strength and support from their sister and friend. And then it's simple. You just need to open the door, walk 20 meters, and you'll find yourself at the top of the dune. What we don't know and will never know is what one did and what two did. The exact circumstances of the tragedy may be unclear, but the guilt of the two brothers is not in doubt, because the crime of one brother is so difficult to separate from the villainy of the other. As they prepared for the crime together and spread terror in the surrounding area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Horror Brothers. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was announced. The brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment with maximum supervision for 22 years for Michel and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by the simple fact that without Louis' confession, the police would still be looking for the girls. To this day, the pain of the families is still very strong. Every year on February 12, Marie Merlin and her son Gregory return to the beach of St. Cecile. It's the place where it all ended for them. Gregory says that today he should be a happy older brother, uncle. Instead, he mourns his sisters, kidnapped from the carnival on a night that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. In February 2003, the blockhouse that became a stumbling block in the case was blown up. The police protected the family from an angry mob, but a few days later, arson destroyed the Jordan family's home.
The names Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer have become synonymous with serial killer in many people's minds. But what if one of the most vicious stalkers in modern history went virtually unnoticed? After serving in the U.S. Army from 1998 to 2001, Israel Keyes is believed to have spent decades traveling the country. Over the course of 10 years, he robbed banks, kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered innocent victims. Keyes kept murder kits containing guns, rope, and other items in secret locations, collecting them before abducting another innocent soul. Using these kits, he killed his chosen victim and then disappeared from the scene. Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, USA, to Mormon parents who homeschooled their children. When the family moved to Stevens County, they attended the War Church, which is known for its racist and anti-Semitic views. A few years later, Keyes would decide to completely renounce religion and declare himself an atheist, but at that time the Keyes family was still friends and lived next door to the Kehoe family. Israel himself was friends with Chevy and Chenny Kehoe, known racists who were later charged with murder and attempted murder. At the age of 20, Keyes joined the U.S. Army. He served at Fort Lewis, Fort Hodge in Egypt, before being honorably discharged in 2000. However, Keyes' life of crime began before he joined the Army. He admitted to raping a very young girl in Oregon, around 96, 98 when he was 18, 20 years old. He told FBI agents that he had taken the girl away from her friends and raped her, but he had not killed her. That was the beginning of a long list of crimes, including robberies and burglaries, that the FBI is now trying to piece together into the early stages of Keyes' criminal career. In 2007, Keyes founded Keyes Construction in Alaska and began working as a construction contractor. It was from this Alaskan base that Keyes traveled to virtually every corner of the United States, where he planned and carried out his crimes. Since 2004, he had been traveling the country, hunting down victims and bearing grisly murder kits filled with money, guns, rope, and other equipment that could be used to kill and dispose of the body. He admitted to the FBI that the money for his travels came not from construction work, but from funds he had obtained during bank robberies. Investigators don't know exactly how many banks he may have robbed during his travels around the country, nor is it known at what point Keyes began killing random victims. Detectives suspect it began 11 years before his arrest. Shortly after his military service ended, there were at least 11 victims of the wily serial killer. On March 16, 2012, Keyes was arrested in Texas after using a bank card belonging to 18-year-old Samantha Kenny, whom he had killed in February. Over the following months, while awaiting trial for her murder, Keyes confessed to several more bloody crimes during 40 hours of interrogation by FBI agents. February 1, 2012, began like any other workday for 18-year-old Samantha Kenny, but unfortunately it ended in unspeakable tragedy. As she was finishing her shift at a small coffee shop called Common Grounds in downtown Anchorage, Alaska, Samantha, who was working as a barista, was approached by a man in a ski mask who asked for a coffee. The man who approached the girl would later be identified as Israel Keyes. After the girl brought the ordered coffee, the visitor suddenly pulled out a gun and demanded that she give him the money. Samantha obediently complied with his demands. Despite this, jumping over the bathhouse counter, Keyes tied the girl's hands with heavy ones and then pushed her into his white Ford Focus. Samantha tried to escape from the kidnapper's grasp, but she failed. In response to the girl's unsuccessful attempt to run, the criminal put a gun to her head and threatened to kill her if she tried again. As Keyes and the still tied-up Samantha drove through the city, he told her that this was just a kidnapping for ransom, and if she behaved obediently, she would return to her family unharmed. It was a lie. Keyes kept Samantha alive for a few more terrifying hours while he drove back to her coffee shop to take her cell phone and send a fake text to her boyfriend, who was supposed to pick her up after his shift. The text sent by the kidnapper read, "Hey, I'm spending a few days with my friends. Tell my dad." Keyes took the girl to his home, where he tied her up in a shed and turned up the radio so no one could hear her screams. He then drove to Samantha's house, demanding that she give him her address so he could get her bank card from her boyfriend's car. In a seemingly happy coincidence, after stealing the card, Keyes ran into Samantha's boyfriend, who was already rattled after learning that she wasn't at work when he arrived to pick her up, and after receiving a strange text from her number, which was actually from Keyes. However, the guy assumed it was just a regular burglar trying to break into his car. Back in Anchorage on February 17, 2012, Keyes began preparing a ransom note, but first he decided to remove Samantha's body from the freezer. He applied makeup to her frozen face, used fishing line to hold her eyes open so she would appear to be alive, and took pictures of her holding a fresh copy of the daily newspaper, as if to prove she was still alive on February 17th. Keyes attached a printed note demanding $30,000 in ransom to the photo. The killer left the note and photo in a park under a wanted poster for a missing dog named Albert, and then used Samantha's phone to text her boyfriend and tell him where to look for the ransom note. A few days later, Keyes drove to Lake Matanuska, where he dismembered the unfortunate girl's body, punched a hole in the ice, and dumped the remains in the lake. Frank Russo, the police detective who interviewed Keyes, says he drilled a hole and went ice fishing on the lake. He tied a piece of the girl's body with wire and attached a weight to it. He then lowered the piece of her body under the water while he continued fishing. I remember asking him, "Did you catch the fish?" And he said, "Yes, I did." I said, "What did you do with it?" "Well, I took it home and ate it," he said. "It was just a sickening admission to me," the detective recalls. Meanwhile, Samantha's dad, James Kenning, believing his daughter was still alive after receiving the staged photo, deposited the money that had been raised through the generosity and participation of locals who could not stay away from the case. However, Keyes made a big mistake by instructing the girl's family to wire the ransom money into her account. The ATM camera managed to photograph the kidnapper's car, and that's how the police were able to determine that the suspect drives a white Ford Focus. With this information, Keyes was soon stopped for a routine vehicle check, and inside the car, police found banknotes, paint from the men who had robbed the bank, a ski mask, and a gun. They also found Samantha's phone and bank card. Keyes was immediately arrested. Keyes was extradited from Texas to Alaska initially on charges of credit card fraud. On April 2, 2012, investigators found Koenig's body in a lake, and on the 18th, a grand jury indicted Keyes for Samantha's kidnapping and murder. Keyes was interrogated for more than 40 hours by police detective Jeff Bell and FBI Special Agent Jolene Godden, and although he was reluctant to give up details of his crimes, he began to confess to several murders he had committed over the past 11 years. After his arrest, Keyes confessed to kidnapping Samantha from the coffee shop. He also gave police much more detail about the crime, but not before making them agree to one condition: that all the details be kept from the press. The reason? He didn't want his young daughter to read about what he did to Samantha. "I'll give you every little detail of the crime if you want. I have so many stories I can tell you," he said. Soon, investigators finally realized that they were dealing with not just a killer, but one of the most cold-blooded, most methodical, and most prolific serial killers of all time. It quickly became clear that Keyes had killed before, in addition to Samantha Koenig. The first murder, according to Keyes' confession to police, occurred in Washington state in the late 1990s. He told authorities that he had killed at least 7 people across the country, although it is believed that Keyes may have killed as many as 11 people in total. In addition to Samantha Koenig, police were able to name 2 more victims, a Vermont couple, Bill and Lorraine Carrier, who had previously been reported missing. Keyes allegedly broke into the couple's home on the night of June 8, 2011. He described his attack on the couple as a quick dash. He cut their telephone lines before breaking into the house with a head torch. He managed to tie up his victims and drive them to an abandoned farm. He shot Bill in the basement and then raped and strangled Lorraine. Their bodies were never found. Chittenden County District Attorney T.J. Donovan said of the Vermont couple, "The evidence shows that in the face of death, Bill and Lorraine showed extraordinary courage and great affection and love for each other. They fought to the end." Keyes later admitted that 2 years before the couple's death, he assembled a murder kit containing a gun, a silencer, ammunition, and garbage bags. The killer hid the kit near the couple's home and later used it to kill Lorraine and Bill. In all, Keyes confessed to killing 4 people in 3 separate incidents in Washington state. He didn't give names, though he likely knew them because he liked to follow news of his crimes online when he returned to Alaska. He also killed a man on the East Coast.
When I first started reading news stories about it, I was super careful. I would never use a personal computer that was connected to me. But then, like you said, I got kind of hooked on the publicity, and I would be at home late at night or whatever and be like, wow, I wonder if there's any more news stories, you know, like a couple glasses of whiskey, and be like, I'm going to check on that. And then I'd do the searches and read and, you know, start commenting on stuff. And I knew that I was getting stupid, I guess.
Keyes buried the body in New York, but killed his victim in another state. He gave investigators no further details about these cases. Bell believes Keyes gave them details about the murders because he knew they already had evidence pointing to him, so he shared more about these murders than the others. Bell believes the interviews were the first time the killer ever spoke about his crimes and what he called his double life. He believes Keyes hid details of the other murders because he did not want his family to know about his secret life of crime. Keyes planned the murders in advance and took extraordinary precautions to avoid being caught. Unlike most serial killers, which made tracking his crimes much more difficult, Keyes had no specific victim type, killing both men and women, but claimed that children and parents were untouchable to him. When asked why he chose his victims, Keyes replied, "I didn't pick, I just randomly." Frank Russo recalls, "I remember asking him why he went into that particular coffee shop on that fateful day, and he simply said, 'Well, it was open late.'" The killer operated away from home and never committed a second crime in the same place. He paid only in cash during his trips and turned off his cell phone, and he had no contact with his victims. Once he had chosen a victim, he would bury the murder kit in the area. As he did with Bill and Lorraine, his kits were found in Alaska and New York, but he admitted to having others prepared in Washington, Wyoming, Texas, and possibly Arizona. Keyes admitted to admiring fellow serial killer Ted Bundy, telling investigators that he saw himself in the famous killer. Dennis Rader, or BTK as he was called, a weakling, because he openly admitted to remorse for his crimes. Monica Dahl, a homicide detective from Anchorage, said of Keyes, "He didn't kidnap and kill people because he was crazy. He didn't kidnap and kill people because his deity told him to or because he had a bad childhood. Israel Keyes did it because it gave him great satisfaction, almost like a drug addict gets great satisfaction from taking drugs. In a way, he was addicted, and he was addicted to the feeling he got from killing." When asked by investigators why he did all these crimes, Keyes simply said, "Why not?" Eventually, investigators realized that Keyes' motive was very simple. He killed because he liked it. He enjoyed it. He liked what he was doing. Goddan adds, he talked about the adrenaline, the excitement he felt while doing it. Keyes himself said, "I am two different people in essence." The criminal admitted that he had been leading a double life for a long time. "Since I was 14, I knew that there were things that seemed completely normal to me, but that no one else considered normal." So investigators began to suspect that he was a serial killer for many years. But when Keyes committed his very first crime remains a mystery to this day. It is interesting to note, however, that when Israel was only 18 years old, a girl disappeared from the place where he lived, who was later found murdered. Julie Marie Harris was 12 years old when she disappeared on March 3, 1996. The girl was a participant in the so-called Special Olympics. Both feet of the teenager were replaced by prosthetics. Julie disappeared from Colville when she went to church. The girl disappeared without a trace. Only some time later, her prosthetic feet were found in the mouth of the Colville River. A year later, part of her skeleton was found. Special Agent Ted Holla notes that investigators asked Israel about Julie and her death. He said that he knew about it, but did not participate in the crime. In addition, he said that the birth of his daughter convinced him of the importance of abandoning the hunt for children. Although this was most likely true, Keyes' daughter was born much later than Julie Harris's murder. One of the missing girl's friends said she remembered Julie talking to Keyes at the pool where she often swam, and even more so, the witness said Julie gave him her address and phone number. Despite the intrigue surrounding Julie Harris's death, Keyes claims he first attempted murder in 97 or 98, when he kidnapped and abused a young girl from an Oregon band. Keyes said it was weird, she was scared, but she was just talking, just little things. "I don't know, it was weird. I was sure I screwed it up that time in Oregon because, I let her go." Israel Keyes never let another victim go again. On December 2, 2012, while Keyes was in jail in Anchorage, he committed suicide. Under his body, a rambling letter was found that was later described as a grisly ode to murder. The note gave no clues to the identities of his other victims, simply describing them as lovely captive butterflies. Another section of the message read, "Your face was framed like a portrait by dark curls, the sunbeams filtering through the red gleams. I wonder what color and how straight they will be, slicked back by the sweat of your blood." On December 10, 2012, Keyes' mother Heidi and 4 of his sisters attended a small memorial service in Deer Park, Washington. Pastor Jake Gardner began the service by saying, "He's not in a good place. He's in a place of eternal torment." Only now has the FBI decided to share with the public the drawings Keyes made in his own blood, which were found in his cell after his suicide. In a desperate attempt to identify other victims of the killer with the help of the public, FBI agents have released grisly drawings that they believe indicate there were actually 11 victims. The skulls are drawn in blood and were found under his bed in his prison cell. One of the drawings reads, "We are one." Israel Keyes is the epitome of the 21st century's most terrifying serial killers, and he comes closest to the terror movie monster of any known criminal. If he hadn't relaxed and killed Samantha Koenig in her hometown that fateful day, the cops, they admit, probably never would have caught him.